Thank you very much, Mr. Charl Niehaus, for joining us this morning. I would have loved you to come to our studio here in Cape Town, but obviously, maybe next time when you are around, you would be able to come, and then maybe after the interview, we can have nice Cape Town fish and chips. Yeah.
I wish I could be there in Cape Town. Cape Town is one of my favorite cities. And yeah, we can
Yes.
have the fish and chips as long as you also promise me one of those beautiful Western Cape winelands wines.
Yes, no, definitely. We'll probably even go to or and get it obviously probably in as well. Yes.
Making sure that I will come.
Yes. But thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. Many people, I mean, in South Africa, especially the youth, don't know the contribution that you have made in the struggle of liberation, especially coming from an Afrikaner family in a Dorpy town called Xeris in the northwest. Can you tell us, Mr. Niehaus, how did you join the struggle? Why did you join the struggle? And the hefty price that you had paid in giving us a non racial, free South Africa?
I'm humbled that you looked into part of my history. I hear you talking about the little town where I was born in what was then known as the Western Transvaal. Today it is the Northwest Province. By the way, that is also the town where President Jacob Zuma was arrested by the apartheid regime many, many decades ago. And after that arrest, that he went to prison for 10 years. Myself, I grew up in a conservative, white Afrikaner community. But at the age of 16, I started asking questions about apartheid. I started becoming deeply concerned about the injustices that I saw around me, the way in which I lived in a middle-class white suburb and lived in very privileged conditions compared to the majority of Black and especially African South Africans. And then in 1976, when the Soweto uprising started, I asked questions in my school. I said to my history teacher, but don't you think that the students in Soweto are correct in rising up against the oppression that they faced with, also in the education system, and the manner in which Afrikaans was unilaterally being imposed on them as a medium of instruction? Of course, that went down very badly in my white Afrikaans school, and I was almost expelled from the school. But be that as it may, I started asking, I believe, the right questions, and the answers that I got was that apartheid in South Africa is a fundamentally unjust system. I came to the conclusion that, in fact, it was a crime against humanity and that it had to be fought as hard as possible. And once I came to that conclusion, I decided that I had no other option but also to take up arms against what is a very violent, repressive regime. And I decided that I not only had to join the African National Congress, but also Umkhonto we Sizwe. So at the young age of 19, in 1979, I crossed the border to Botswana. I met with some of the ANC comrades and leadership outside the country. I told them, I want to join the ANC and I want to be part of the armed struggle. Now, I think some of them were quite taken aback by this young Afrikaner boy who said that he wanted to take up arms against his own people. But I explained myself. I explained to them that I am absolutely clear that apartheid is fundamentally wrong, and it had to be fought by whatever means necessary. So that is how it happened that I joined the ANC and Umkhonto we Sizwe. I then became involved in the underground military activities of Umkhonto we Sizwe. I helped to smuggle weapons and limpet mines, AK-47s, across the borders into the country, establish arms caches. I planted a number of limpet mines, especially in the Western Transvaal at some police stations. I detonated a bomb at the recruitment center of the South African Defence Force in the Carlton Center in Johannesburg. And I was involved in the identification of targets such as the South African Broadcasting Corporation and the Johannesburg Gasworks. While I was busy with all of this, I obviously became the target of the South African police and this, especially the notorious South African security police. They infiltrated the Umkhonto we Sizwe cell that I worked in. They planted someone there who was a spy.
Yes.
And eventually in late 1983, I was arrested for my activities. I was then charged. I appeared in the Johannesburg South High Court with a charge of high treason against me. And I was sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment. So that meant that for the next 9.5 years, I spent in the Pretoria Maximum Security Prison. And then in 1991, when the negotiations between the African National Congress and the ANC commenced, I was eventually also released as part of those negotiations. I immediately, the day that I got out of prison, I went to the ANC's offices in Johannesburg. By then, the ANC was already unbanned. And I walked in there and said, I'm reporting back for duty. I'm ready to work. And I was given the opportunity to work in the ANC's Department of Information and Publicity. And after a period of time where I think I also proved myself that I was competent in the field of communication, I was made the national spokesperson of the African National Congress and the head of the ANC's Media Liaison Unit. This was a huge honor for me. I was still quite young. I was still in my early 30s when this happened. And I was privileged that then for a number of years, I could work very, very closely with President Nelson Mandela. I was a junior member of the ANC's negotiating team at CODESA. And I must emphasize a junior member because I do not want to take responsibility for the many mistakes
What?
were made. While I was a member of that negotiating team, I did raise my concerns that I thought we were making far too many compromises, that we were entering into what was called the so-called sunset clauses that guaranteed the jobs of white civil servants, that we agreed to Section 25 of our national constitution that guarantees property rights. And I was very upset about that because I felt strongly that the ownership of property in South Africa in the hands of the whites is because of land theft that happened during a long period of colonization, and that it was totally wrong for us to give a guarantee of property rights. You don't guarantee to people who've stolen your goods the right to them to have the ownership of the stolen goods. But okay, I was young. I was still a junior member in the ANC. I registered my concerns, but I couldn't change those decisions. I feel sad today that when I look back after 30 years of our democracy, that some of those concerns that I raised have in fact come true. To some extent, although I do not want to be arrogant, I
Yes.
can say today that yes, I told you so, and the consequences of what you have compromised us with are a dreadful disaster for the people of South Africa.
Yes, yes. So after you when you were released from prison and became the national spokesperson, at the time, obviously the top six: President Nelson Mandela, Deputy President was Walter Sisulu, and the SG, the Secretary General, was our current president, President Cyril Ramaphosa, with his deputy Jacob Zuma. Was Thabo Mbeki the chair, President Thabo Mbeki as well?
That's correct.
How was it working with these individuals, especially our current president, who is President Cyril Ramaphosa? Because I'm sure, as the spokesperson, you work closely with him.
Yes, I had to work closely with him, but I'm on record to have said that I was not impressed with the man. I was not impressed because, as far as I am concerned, he was parachuted into the leadership of the ANC. He didn't have the history, he didn't have the seniority, he didn't deserve to be there as the Secretary General of the ANC. In fact, you refer to President Jacob Zuma, who was his deputy. President Zuma was a far more senior member of the African National Congress than Cyril Ramaphosa. And he far more deserved to have been in a more senior position than Ramaphosa. But unfortunately, there were those powers in South Africa, especially amongst the white monopoly capitalists, those who were also part of the people who assisted Ramaphosa to set up the National Union of Mine Workers. Because we must remember that the National Union of Mine Workers was set up as a sweetheart union by the big white monopoly capitalist mine owners, by the Oppenheimers and also by the Menels. And these were the people, the Oppenheimers and the Menels, the owners of Anglo-American and Anglo-Val, who put pressure on President Mandela and said, we think Cyril Ramaphosa is just the right guy for the job. Now, of course, from their perspective, he was the right guy for the job because they knew he was their man. They knew he was going to take care of them. You know, you must go and read Anthony Butler's book on Cyril Ramaphosa, where he refers to a conversation that he had with the wife of Clive Menel, Irene Menel, a very influential person within the white monopoly capitalist community.
And they owned Anglo-Val, right? Am I right? The Menels. They owned Anglo-Val at the time.
That's correct. The second largest mining house in South Africa.
Yes.
They were close to President Mandela because we must remember that it was the Menels, when President Mandela was in jail, who had the foresight to go and pay for the school fees for President Mandela's two daughters, Zinzi and Zenani. So they endeared themselves to President Mandela. But I was still telling you about Irene Menel, who said we had helped Cyril Ramaphosa when he was a young student. We also made him a member of the Urban Foundation. You remember the Urban Foundation was set up by those of the white monopoly capitalist big businesses in South Africa. And they tried to identify some black leaders that they felt they could manage, that they could manipulate, that they could shape. And they saw in Cyril Ramaphosa a prime candidate to do so. So Irene Menel said, we appointed Cyril Ramaphosa as a member of the Urban Foundation because we knew that if we took great care of him, he will be, and listen to this, he will be a good insurance policy for us in the future. So you asked me what I thought of Cyril Ramaphosa. I always saw him as an agent of white monopoly capitalism. I never experienced him as a competent politician. I also have never experienced him even as a competent and capable businessman, because he didn't make his millions. In fact, now it has turned into billions because of great business acumen. He was given the money, and he was given that money in the process of having sold out the people of South Africa and having compromised the ANC to the point where today the ANC has become a total sellout organization.
If I can take you back, Mr. Niehaus, if you remember in 1985, and the leader of Anglo-American, Gavin Reilly, with other prominent business leaders, Hewletts and so on, after the Rubicon speech, they flew to Zambia to go meet up with the African National Congress. And obviously they met with the African National Congress to negotiate some form of a way forward, and also to assess what the African National Congress thought of the economy going forward. Don't you think that in some form of a way was more, the compromise started then in 1985 in Zambia when the African National Congress met with big business? But at that time, Cyril Ramaphosa was not in the picture.
You're absolutely right that was the beginning of the engagement, but also of the selling out. You're also correct to say that Cyril Ramaphosa was not personally there because he was too junior, but he was certainly part of that whole process. Now, if you listen to an interview that was done by Ronnie Casserols about that meeting that you've just referred to in Zambia, in Lusaka, he said he was astonished how quickly the delegation of the African National Congress, which included also Thabo Mbeki, were prepared to make agreements with those white captains of industry and tell them that the fundamental economic situation in South Africa will not be changed by a transition, by the negotiations, and by the African National Congress becoming the governing party. So then already, in those mid-1980s, guarantees were given to the white monopoly capitalists that it will be business as usual. So I always insist that the selling out process had started long before the ANC was unbanned, long before the negotiations of CODESA commenced. It started already during the exile period. I want to refer you to a very interesting bit of history that came to the fore recently with the funeral of Aziz Pahad. Aziz Pahad was a very, very close associate of Thabo Mbeki. Him and his brother Esop, who is also late now, may their souls rest in peace, were part of the initial discussions and negotiations before the ANC was unbanned. And it wasn't just that discussion that you referred to in Lusaka. There were many meetings in London, in Geneva, in Switzerland, and other parts of Europe. And there were intelligence operatives of the old apartheid regime that would meet with Thabo Mbeki, with Aziz Pahad and Esop Pahad. One of those intelligence operatives was a certain professor, Willie Esterhuizen. He was a professor of political philosophy at the University of Stellenbosch. And hey presto, at the funeral of Comrade Aziz Pahad, there was a video recording of Professor Willie Esterhuizen expressing his deep sympathies And interestingly enough, immediately after that video by Professor Esterhuise, President Thabo Mbeki spoke. And he referred to those engagements that they had with Professor Esterhuise and the role that Aziz Pahad and himself played. So we must be very clear that the negotiating process was a well-planned, well-handled, and well-manipulated process by the white monopoly capitalists and imperialists to make sure that once the negotiations started, that the fundamental economic transformation that we require in South Africa would never happen, and that the continuation of economic exploitation and the economic powers that existed also under the apartheid era would continue to prevail into our new democracy. And I must say, they have been hugely successful. And Cyril Ramaphosa was an important person, an important person that they used and played a role in achieving that. Especially, as I said to you, after he was infiltrated into the ANC, was appointed as the Secretary General of the ANC, and the role that he subsequently played. And then, of course, the tragedy of the way in which he was brought back into the leadership of the ANC at the Mangaung conference of the ANC in 2012, which was really a sad development because that opened the door for what we see today and the very negative role that he is continuing to play.
Interesting. So you are saying that during the transition, it's big capital who won the day. But why couldn't government police big capital in some form of a way?
You see, the problem is when big capital starts managing to gain control over the lives of those who are in leadership in a liberation movement such as the African National Congress. What happened was that already during the exile time, some of the leaders of the African National Congress started receiving largesses, started receiving money from white monopoly capital. They started to have some of their family members being taken care of. I've already told you that the Menolds took care of the children of President Mandela, and there are other examples of other leaders who were in the National Executive Committee of the ANC. By the time that the ANC was unbanned and that leadership came into South Africa, they didn't have a lot of resources. Because remember, they were in exile. They were fighting the liberation struggle. They were not necessarily able to make a lot of money for themselves. And these big owners of industry and capital understood that. And they went to these leaders and said to them, look, we know that you are under pressure now. You're back. You need a house. Your family have been waiting for you to return. They have been hoping that when you return, you will bring a change to their lives. You don't have the resources to do so. You've got children that you want to put in good schools, etc., etc. We will take care of it. Let us give you a house. Let us help you to buy a good car. Let us pay for your children's tuition fees. Let us take care of your family. But as Judge Mogoeng many years later said, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So it started by making promises that sounded very benevolent. But then, of course, when the negotiations started, those very same people who were now the sponsors of these leaders of the African National Congress would come to them and say, you know, there's a clause in the Constitution that we would like you to pay attention to. We don't think it's a good idea for you not to guarantee property rights. We think it is important that you must put a clause in the Constitution that will circumscribe the role of the South African Reserve Bank. We think it's important that you must allow the private shareholding in the South African Reserve Bank to continue, etc., etc. And when any of these leaders then wanted to oppose what were proposed to them, they would be told, well, you know, if you don't want to assist us, we may have to reconsider our arrangement with you. We may have to reconsider the funding that we've given you. And remember, if you cooperate with us, there's still a lot down the road that can come your way. There are going to be shareholdings that we will be prepared to make available to you. You can become fabulously rich people. And so it went on and on. So these leaders sold out. The sad thing is that the consequence of that selling out process is that the whole ANC became derailed and started becoming a sellout organization. And beyond that, the sad thing is that as we opened membership of the African National Congress, sometimes in a very, very uncritical way, just allowing anyone to come and join the ANC, free for all. Many people joined the African National Congress without any political content, without a deep political commitment to the liberation struggle that myself and earlier comrades had joined the ANC for. They joined the ANC for one reason, and that was to make money. They saw the ANC as an instrument for empowering themselves in business and financially. You know, I always tell the story. Sorry, I tend to talk quite a lot, but I just want to tell this little story. I met with a very senior leader of the ANC Youth League in KwaZulu-Natal. In fact, I remember very clearly it was in Umhlanga where we met.
Yes.
And this young man, when I met with him, we talked a bit of politics, but he kept on talking business, business, business. And eventually I said to him, comrade, tell me, are you in business? Are you in politics? He gave me a very confused look. He said, but what is the difference? And you see, in that answer is the summary of the problem that we have. The ANC has now become a business for self-enrichment, not a liberation movement for the empowerment and for justice for the majority of South Africans.
Interesting. I want to come back to this financial situation. When you came out of prison and other comrades were coming back from exile, obviously you didn't have any finances. So obviously you needed some form of income. How would you have gotten that income without any assistance? Some of you were reintegrated in society, pensions and so on. Don't you think there could have been some? Did the ANC have funds? Did you guys get a salary? How was it? Because obviously, if there is no income, you will try to get income somewhere. How are you gonna eat? How are you gonna, travel, campaign for your specific party? So, how was it like in your experience, Mr. Deal?
Look, it was difficult. I can tell you that when I went back to full-time employment in the African National Congress, I told you that I went to the ANC offices and said, I'm ready for deployment. The job that I got, I received 2,000 rands a month for it.
2,000 rands.
But okay, don't look about 2,000 rands in today's terms. That was now 1991, going into 1992. Yeah, so it was a little bit better, but still it was not a lot of money. So yes, it was difficult. And I do think the leadership of the ANC and also the progressive community in the world should have foreseen that if there was not action taken to at least take care of the basic needs of members of the African National Congress who returned from exile and who were not in a strong financial position, that would potentially open the door for corruption. But unfortunately, that issue was not properly addressed. I don't know if it was done just as an oversight or if it was done deliberately. But the reality is, because it was not properly addressed, it left the door open for these white monopoly capitalists to get themselves involved in this, to get their hands onto people, and to manage to start manipulating some of our comrades. And they did so to great success and effect, and to a huge disaster for the future of the national liberation movement, which is the African National Congress.
Do you think, Mr. Niehaus, the ANC from exile in Lusaka, did it have proper economic framework that, look, if we go into government, this is going to be the program that we follow, or they just relied on the Freedom Charter? Did they come back with archives and archives, of the economy, that this is the policy that we are going to follow, or did they follow maybe what was currently there in South Africa and, as you say, compromised during doing so?
Look, there was a lot of research done by the ANC. The ANC had an economic research unit. It was under the management of a very good economist with the name of Meva Pillay. But when we came back to South Africa, I found that the role of the economic research unit became relegated. As some of these white monopoly capitalists managed to get access to the leadership of the African National Congress. And also, you had these big think tanks from Goldman Sachs, from all these Old Mutual and all these big companies who started to come and tell the ANC what should the economic policy be. And there were those within the African National Congress. Some of the economists in the ANC were quite happy and prepared to take the advice from the Goldman Sachses, from the Old Mutuals, from the net banks, from the Volkskas and Absas of this world. And one of those was a young man who later on became our governor of our Reserve Bank, and later on also the Minister of Finance, Titu Mboweni. And Titu played a very insidious role, because in 1991, President Mandela, freshly out of prison, was invited to go to the World Economic Forum in Davos. And I don't know why, but Titu ended up being the economic advisor that went with him. A speech was written for President Mandela based on the research that the ANC's Economic Research Unit had done. That speech was mainly written by Meva Pillay, but I myself, as the spokesperson at that time, was involved in brushing up the speech, and a number of other people. So I've got intimate knowledge of what the content of that speech was. And that speech reflected the ANC's commitment to a continuation of a central government-controlled economy. It also reflected the ANC's continuing commitment to the nationalization of the big mines in South Africa and the large economic institutions. So that is the speech with which President Mandela went to Davos in his briefcase, so to speak. What happened in Davao apparently is that Tito Mboweni then went through a process of introducing him to a whole number of big white monopoly capitalist and imperialist economists gathered there in Davao.
Mm.
And as they started talking to him, they said to him, no, don't go with the nationalization program. We are opposed to it. If you go that route, economy in South Africa is going to collapse. We will withdraw our investments. We will not be part of this kind of arrangement that you are talking about. Tito Mboweni then took that speech of President Mandela in his hotel room and he scratched out the paragraphs that committed the ANC to what was the official ANC economic policy at that time, nationalization and a central government-directed economy. He replaced it with new liberal economic concepts. Now, let me emphasize to you, this was not a decision taken at the level of the National Executive Committee of the ANC. This was simply, at that stage, a junior member of the ANC, Tito Mboweni, sitting in his hotel room in Davao and literally trashing the official economic policy of the ANC. In fact, a couple of years later, he joked about what he did then. He was speaking here in Johannesburg at a conference at the Hyatt Hotel. And he said, yeah, well, I sat there. I had a nice glass of whiskey and I trashed the whole speech. I threw it literally into the garbage can. I'm quoting the man.
He was probably totally opposed to nationalization himself.
He may have been, yes. In terms of his later performance and his history, it is clear where he came from. And of course, you must also understand again how the imperialists were working cleverly with also ANC intellectuals in exile. Because remember, Tito got his education in the United Kingdom at a very liberal, new liberal university. Similarly to the kind of education that President Thabo Mbeki got in the UK. So when you see that doors were opened for ANC promising intellectuals to go to certain universities and get a certain education and get certain ideas also exposed to, you must understand that this was not coincidental. This was part of the bigger plan. But let me return now to President Mandela, not an economist, someone who had just come recently out of jail, who is relying on an economic advisor to assist him in an environment which was quite complex at the World Economic Forum in Davao. And Tito Mboweni manipulated that whole situation. Now, of course, we know that Tito had subsequently been very well rewarded for his actions. He was well taken care of by Goldman Sachs. He was well taken care of by various big business interests. And even during the time that he was the governor of the South African Reserve Bank and subsequently his short spell as Minister of Finance, he continued to enforce and implement economic policies that were to their benefit. And let us not forget, the person who was behind the appointment of De Ruyter as the CEO of Eskom, coming from Nampak, was Tito Mboweni. Because at the time when De Ruyter was the CEO of Nampak, Tito Mboweni was the chair of the board of Nampak. And he recommended to cabinet that De Ruyter was just the right person. And what did he mean by just the right person? Just the right person to do to Eskom what he did to Nampak. to dismember it, to break it up, and to finally run it into the ground. And that is exactly what Aretta did until the story between him and some of the cabinet members in the cabinet went sour. But the long
Yes.
and the short of it is Tito Mboweni and people of his ilk had played an insidiously manipulative role in steering us away from those initial, very well thought through, very clearly worked out economic policies that the ANC had. If you go to the various strategy and tactic documents of the 50s and 60s, there is a clear economic policy. The ANC was not some babe in the woods. It was not a novice in terms of economic policy. It had good thinking, strong socialist economists in their ranks. But all of this was undone by this kind of manipulation that took place and the way in which white monopoly capitalism managed to bring in a number of people who were infiltrated in order to secure that they can destroy the original clear pro-socialist, pro-nationalization, pro-developmental state economy and economic programs that the ANC had.
Interesting, Mr. Niehaus. I want us to go into your political party, to tell us about your political party, ARETA, African Radical Economic Transformation Alliance. How was it established? Because many might argue it's a disgruntled RET faction of the ANC that just didn't win against President Cyril Ramaphosa.
ARETA was established on the basis of decisions that had been taken by myself and a number of other comrades. It was a broad-based decision that we need to continue to pursue the original ideals with which we joined the African National Congress as a liberation movement. Those ideals for full economic liberation in addition to being liberated from racism. The ideals that I bought into when I joined the ANC at the age of 19, as I've said, in 1976. And you know, I used to listen carefully to the speeches of President Oliver Tambo. When President Tambo would say to us on Radio Freedom, freedom is not just liberation from racism, but freedom must always also be liberation from economic oppression. And he would always say that racism and economic oppression in South Africa, through the model of colonialism of a special kind, dovetails. And we will only see full liberation once we can also address the transformation of our economy and bring it in the hands of the majority of Black and especially African South Africans. So those are the ideals with which I joined the African National Congress at that time. And the other comrades who with me formed the African Radical Economic Transformation Alliance. And those are the ideals that we still continue today to be committed to. Full economic liberation. If you go to the ARETA website, which is www.areta.sa.org, and you go to the 10-point plan to save our country, you will see that all those 10 points are in fact a reflection of those original liberation ideals and especially a commitment to fundamental economic transformation and liberation in South Africa. So why am I saying all of this to you? I'm saying it because I'm answering you on the allegation that some people make that this was just an organization that came about out of anger as a reaction. No. It is an organization that is rooted in the long history of liberation in South Africa. And its foundation is still those original liberation ideals. We are sad that the ANC, as a former liberation movement, had betrayed those ideals. You know, it's not a case that we left the ANC. It is far more a situation that the ANC left us. The ANC moved on to become a new liberal organization with new liberal economic policies, to become a policeman and agent for white monopoly capitalism, to destroy our state-owned enterprises, to betray the principle that had been critical to the whole liberation struggle, and that was the need for the land to be returned to the indigenous people, to the original owners. And all of those ideals are contained in the policy program of ARETA. So no, we're not a reaction.
Yes.
We are built on a foundation of clear liberation ideals, which had been part of our lives throughout, and the reason also why we joined the liberation struggle in the first place.
That's great. We can all agree, Mr. Niehaus, that our country is not in good shape. The massive unemployment, especially amongst the youth, it's over 50%. The electricity crisis that's decimating small businesses by the hour. The state-owned institutions that are being weakened. There's just a whole lot of problem, a non-growing economy. How is Aretta going to solve this? What are you guys proposing? How are you going to solve these issues that we have?
Let me agree with you that the economy is in dire straits. And let me immediately state that the reason why our economy is in the disaster that it is because neoliberal economic policies have been followed for most of the last 30 years of this so-called democracy that we have in South Africa. So when you ask me what Aretta is going to do, first of all, we must get rid of neoliberal economy because it is not serving the majority of our people. We must replace it with a clear understanding that we need to have a strong interventionist state that is committed to grow this economy in a way that will mean that the state's institutions has to be strengthened and built out. Now that brings me immediately to state-owned enterprises. Under the new liberal economic policy program, and especially what is happening now under Cyril Ramaphosa, where new liberalism is in fact on steroids in South Africa, we are seeing the destruction of our state-owned enterprises. What happened with Eskom, what continues to happen with its dismemberment, with its deliberate mismanagement, because what is happening with the lack of power that we have today, with the way in which we are not utilizing our resources, including also our very, very well endowed coal resources properly, the manner in which we mismanage Eskom is deliberate. And the intention is very clearly to make sure that Eskom will ultimately be fully dismembered and privatized. So what they want to do is Eskom, which is the electricity power, the network of our economy, which is critical if any economy is to succeed. they want to privatize that. Henry Kissinger many years ago said, if you want to control a country, lay your hands on its electricity supply, on its power supply, and you can manipulate and push it in whatever direction you want. So what they do with Eskom today is what they've done in the past with Denel, with Armscor, with SAA, with the post office. I can give you numerous examples. We're going the same route now also with Transnet, which is being mismanaged, where senior, well-educated and very well-established black managers are forced to resign. We are faced with a situation where Aretta will have to intervene to make sure that our state-owned enterprises are no longer dismembered, are no longer privatized, but are re-strengthened again. And those state-owned enterprises that had been privatized in the past, we will have to do what President Lula did in Brazil. By presidential decree, return those state-owned enterprises back to government control. And we will have to nationalize our South African Reserve Bank. You seem to laugh.
Yeah, no, I'm listening. So you're calling for more state monopolies. Most of the strategic sector of the economy must be controlled and solely owned by the state. You calling for that?
No, I'm not calling for sole ownership, but I call for a continuation of a strong role of state-owned enterprises in our economy. And I understand the role in the past that state-owned enterprises played in the empowerment of the poor in South Africa. At that stage, it was empowerment simply of mainly white Afrikaner poor. But state-owned enterprises played a huge role in the upliftment of those poor Afrikaners. Now, if we look at that model, why can't we utilize also our state-owned enterprises as long, and I must put this as a caveat, as long as we improve on our managerial processes and control of the state-owned enterprises, because as I've said to you earlier, SOEs have deliberately been run into the ground and mismanaged. So part of a continuation of state involvement in these central enterprises must also mean an improvement in the management of those enterprises. But we had good managers like Marcelo Coco, Brian Molefe, and others who were removed because their effectiveness was flying in the face of the plan to dismember these enterprises and to destroy them, and therefore they had to be removed.
I see. I see. So obviously, I do understand the role that the state-owned enterprises played after the Anglo-Boer War in eradicating Afrikaner poverty. But obviously, at that specific time, you went and obviously economic embargoes were also there. So the state had to grow capacity to employ and keep the apartheid system running. But now it's a total different globalized economy. If you're still calling for state own ownership on that, where does private business play a role in this?
Private business will work in a partnership with state-owned businesses and a strong interventionist state. But if you simply want to leave the South African economy in the hands of a capitalist-driven private ownership, we will see a further continuation of the disaster that we have at the moment unfolding before our eyes. We need a deliberate economic intervention for job creation, for the growth of this economy in a way that will also make capital available, and as far as possible, affordable capital available to small and medium-sized emerging Black business people. None of these things are going to happen if we have an unbridled capitalist economic system. It just simply is not going to happen. We need to give direction to this economy. We need to give direction to the economy in a way that will make sure that it creates jobs, not just optimize profits. Make sure that the South African Reserve Bank will put capital, money into the economy, will play a developmental role, not just chasing after inflation targeting. And those are the things that must happen and can only happen if you have a strong state with a clear developmental economic policy program that makes sure that the direction in which this economy moves is through state intervention, not simply through capitalist privatization. Privatization is simply based on the optimization of profit. And optimization of profit in the South African economy under the current circumstances, with the highest levels of unemployment that we have in the world, with the disaster that young people are faced with, will simply mean that more and more of the majority of youth in South Africa will be unemployed, will not have a future, and will not be given any chance to grow this economy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Niehaus. You spoke about small business, and obviously, as you talk about the radical economic transformation, we can't leave out small businesses. And we know in this country we need quite a whole lot of entrepreneurs and small businesses to create value in the marketplace, and as a result to that, create jobs. But obviously, we're facing quite a whole lot of challenges. Access to market, access to funding, the electricity crisis. Have you been engaging with small businesses and just having a program on that? How is Aretta going to assist small businesses?
You see, you can't talk about assistance for small businesses outside the context of making affordable capital available to those small businesses. So the first thing that we need to address is how are we going to transform our financial institutions in such a way that they will make capital available for small and medium-sized businesses in an affordable way, and not in the way that we've seen during the last couple of years, especially during also the COVID-19 disaster, where you saw that there were so-called rescue and support packages for small and medium-sized businesses. But even the minister responsible for that had to acknowledge that the vast majority of benefactors of that assistance that were regulated and put through our commercial banks had been white, medium, and small businesses. Over 70%, in fact, of those who benefited were from the white community. Now, how do you avoid that? You avoid that by the establishment of a state bank, which I'm absolutely flabbergasted that the South African government, and again I must refer to Tito Mboweni, who was one of the people who dragged his feet on the establishment of a state bank for the whole period that he was the Minister of Finance. But the moment that he left government and he sat on his avocado farm in Limpopo, he started tweeting, "No, we need a state bank." I must say I lost my temper because I know how he consistently opposed the establishment of a state bank. And now he wanted to come and play a populist game. So I used some rather unpalatable words for him. I said to him on Twitter, "Yo moer Titu." But I meant it. Because if we had the establishment of a state bank long ago, if we had also a change in the ownership of the South African Reserve Bank, and we got rid of this private shareholding of the Reserve Bank, if we changed the mandate of the South African Reserve Bank, as the previous public protector, Busisiwe Nkobane, suggested, when she did that investigation and presented her report on the SAIX debacle, when she said the South African Reserve Bank ought to have a new mandate, which is also a mandate for economic growth. Remember what they did? They used that very progressive proposal that she made against her, and it featured prominently in the ultimate impeachment process that were brought against her. Now, I know why the South African Reserve Bank is regulated by a clause in our constitution that defines in the most narrow way possible that you can imagine its mandate as simply to manage and control inflation and inflation targeting. That was proposed to the negotiating team of the African National Congress by Goldman Sachs, because they didn't want a South African Reserve Bank that could play a role of opening this economy for growth, which would mean that you would generate economic challenge to their control and monopoly over the economy in South Africa. So Aretta will immediately nationalize the South African Reserve Bank. It will change the mandate of the South African Reserve Bank so that it becomes a growth-orientated and job creation national central bank. We will establish a state bank. We will renationalize the state-owned enterprises that have been privatized, and we will bring an end to the breaking down and dismemberment of those state-owned enterprises such as Eskom that are still in the hands of state control. But beyond that, we will also go for a national call-up program, because we believe that there must be a national call-up for all youth in this country, and that youth of 18 years and older must have a minimum of 1 year of a national call-up where they can become part of programs for vocational training, eventually become part of programs for infrastructural development, and help the youth of this country also to develop skills that they don't get today, because the sad reality is that the majority of our youth are unemployed, are sitting at home, are learning bad habits, do not get skills, and are not able to contribute to our economy.
To contribute. Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Niehaus. Just to close off, are you going to be contesting all 9 provinces? Because we're having load shedding at 12. Yeah.
My apologies, because there's another example of how the mismanagement of Eskom impacts even on our ability to talk. But absolutely, we will contest the national election and also the elections in all 9 provinces. We have registered as a national political party. We have established structures throughout the country in all 9 provinces already. We are a young party. We only started on the 23rd of February of this year. But I'm happy to tell you that we've signed up 320,000 members.
Wow.
So we are one of the fastest growing young political parties in South Africa. But we're not a party that likes to work on the basis of celebrities and big fanfare. I've deliberately, together with my national executive, said we're not going to have huge rallies. We're not going to fill big stadiums. The limited resources that we have, we're going to work on the ground in community meetings throughout the country. And that is what we have done. So you may not necessarily always see huge crowds associated with Aretta, but I can assure you that we have reached to the far-flung corners of this country. If you go to the villages of Limpopo, and you ask people there if they know about Aretta, they will tell you they do, because our organizers have been there. They were not there with flashy cars. They were not there with overhead projectors. They were simply there with a piece of paper on a flip chart explaining what the policy positions of Aretta is. And that is what we've done throughout the country. We are working a little bit under the radar, but I'm promising you, once the elections of 2024 comes, we're going to rise our head, and many people will be surprised by how well we will be doing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Niehaus. Viva Aretta, viva!
Thank you. Viva Aretta, viva!